Okay, this presentation is going to provide a very quick, rapid overview of some of the important information and examples that sort of define part 2 of this particular. I'm going to talk about strategies for effective, selective, and constructed response development. That's going to play a big role in part 2 of the course. The course, part 2, also addresses the development of rubrics, and I'm not going to cover that in this big, brief overview, but just know that that is coming, as well as some information and examples about the use of portfolios as an assessment framework. The course kind of ends by having you look at some information associated with how you can improve your instructional practice using some interesting strategies associated with assessment. And kind of integrated throughout all of part 2 that's different from part 1 is the fact that you have 2 projects that you're going to be completing. And those projects are represent an application of everything that is addressed in part 2 of. Okay, so I'm going to begin this brief overview by looking at assessment from a more formal, kind of textbooky sort of way. And I'm going to use as my examples some information associated with kind of a social studies case. So here you see a book, The Virginia Adventure, written specifically for social studies in the middle school grades for students in Virginia. And so I'm going to kind of use this as a framework for addressing some of the outcomes associated with being able to create good assessment items. If you were to go to the Teaching Resources Center on the campus of beautiful Radford University, you would find this book along with a teacher guide written by the author as well. And in that teacher guide, you would find pre-developed assessments. Example, this is from Chapter 8 of that text. Here you see an opportunity for the students to communicate some information about important people who were important in Virginia history. And in this case, they get to pick 3 people from the list and write a complete sentence telling something interesting about him or her. And this is not a very great assessment item for a couple of good reasons that are presented in the assessment guide. You would also find in the book assessment items like this. This is an item asking the students to match or fill in the blank from a word list, a word bank on the left, and you will notice that the word bank includes the proper nouns like Confederacy and Union, and then words like slaves and abolitionists. This is not a very good assessment item either, for a couple of very good reasons that you'll learn more about later. Here is another couple of assessment items, again, created as part of that text. Answer each question with complete sentences. Item 12 says, was President Lincoln for or against slavery? I'm not sure if you would get the answer right if you just wrote for or against, or if you just wrote President Lincoln was against slavery, if that would give you full credit. I'm not sure. But that's not a very well-written assessment item either. And here are a collection of true and false items included on one of the assessments from that text. And again, if you examine these assessment items, you would find that some of them are okay for true and false, and some of them are poorly written and would result in data that was not that does not provide good evidence of validity. So this part of the class is about evaluating existing assessment items and trying to determine what is good about them and what isn't good about them, as well as writing your own good assessment items. So that's what. And I want to remind you, the big picture of this particular part of the class resonates with the big picture for the entire text as communicated by the author probably from the first page of the book, and that is that the better you are at assessing student learning, the better teacher you're going to be, for lots of good reasons. And some of those reasons will be highlighted throughout Part 2 of the class. I just wanted to say a quick word about one of the assumptions that this class has is that you think about learning as doing. Learning is being able to do something different than you could or couldn't do before you had some kind of an instructional intervention. And every time I think about learning like that, I'm reminded of this statement by Aristotle, which I always liked. That we become just by performing just acts. In other words, we become what we practice. We learn what we practice doing. That's what we learn, and that's what we become. And I am also reminded of this every time I see the Nike logo, which is everywhere, that learning is doing something. Learning is being able to do something. And a good assessment item is something that measures whether or not you can do that thing that you want your students to be able to do. So, important. Okay, just to remind you that assessment, the definition is formally measuring the status of students with respect to variables of interest. And there are quite a few important variables of interest that teachers generally formally assess. Expected learning outcome performance is one, and sometimes teachers measure unexpected learning outcome performance because it's important to them. Embedded practice performance is very important. Expected attitudes and motivation and unexpected attitudes might be important variables of interest for an educator. Also, the perception of students about certain instructional components might be a variable of interest. So asking students whether or not an introduction was motivating, or whether it did a good job of providing a big picture for what is expected, that kind of thing. Asking for attitude or input about that and measuring that formally. Also, any concerns that students might have about socially interacting with each other might represent some important variables of interest. And just to remind you that in the instructional process, that there are some specific places in the process where teachers do formally, and those include perhaps pre-testing during the introduction, or at least gauging in some formal sense where learners might be at with respect to a particular kind of area of skills. Of course, practice and feedback represents a very important part of the instructional process, where teachers will formally measure status. And of course, the terminal assessment, or the post-test, or the big test. That is also an area where teachers will formally assess the student's status. How well can they do the things you wanted them to learn how to do? Of course, another review from Part 1 of the course is that quality assessments, good assessments, are reliable, they're valid, and they're free from bias. And this was the emphasis of Part 1 of the course, was examining ways in which you can measure estimates of reliability and measure evidence of validity, and also just identify how things may be biased, and what you as a teacher can do to help mitigate the bias that's going to be there. Okay, well, the lion's share of Part 2 for this class addresses developing assessment items, and this quick presentation is about the three easy steps that you can take in order to develop valid and reliable assessments. These three steps just basically are to identify and classify the outcomes, the performance outcomes, and then you select the most appropriate type of assessment item based on their classification, and then after that you follow the rules for writing good assessments. Again, I'm going to just quickly go through this as I sort of set the stage for the information that's presented in the text and in the course notes. Okay, step 1 is regarding identifying what type of outcome might be included in a statement, in an instructional objective statement. And the notes, the assessment guide that you have for this class, identifies 5 general categories of learning outcomes, and they can be remembered, if you care to remember them, with the mnemonic VICAM. And that stands for verbal information, intellectual skills, and there are different types of intellectual skills that we'll talk a little bit about later. Cognitive strategies, attitudes, and motor skills, or sometimes called psycho. So again, the assessment guide includes the steps involved in being able to take a performance outcome and identify which type of skill it represents. And once you do that, then your next job is to try to identify, well, what are the most ideal ways to measure those skills? Given the fact that as teachers, not everything can be performance-based. Sometimes you have to contrive the testing environment. For example, a typical multiple choice question, in order to measure, whether or not students can explain something well. Obviously, multiple choice is not how you would want them to perform an act of explanation out in the real world. But within the parameters of teaching groups of people and trying to teach effectively and efficiently, sometimes multiple choice may be your best option. And multiple choice items can be used to assess skills in valid and reliable fashion. So, and that would be an example of a selected response item. So step 2 is about identifying what types of items are most appropriate for what your skill type is. 3, you actually follow the rules of good construction. So let me just give you an example of what we're talking about here. Here is a social studies standard for first grade. Students will describe the stories of American leaders and their contributions to our country, with emphasis on George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, and George Washington Carver. Okay. So describing the stories is the performance outcome. So in this case, it's verbal information. Describing a story would be verbal information. And based on the assessment guide, some of the valid types of constructed response items would include fill in the blank or short answer. And there aren't really any selected response types that would be appropriate. No multiple choice, true or true, false, that kind of thing. That would not be appropriate for verbal information. So create a multiple choice if you wanted them to describe something. And so here's an example of a reasonable assessment item to measure that skill. So there you have it. All right, so I'm going to kind of go through some different types of learning outcomes and examine what types of constructed response or selected response items would be appropriate, and then just some examples. Stick in the with social studies. Here's a K9 standard, not a dog standard, K.9, which I think is further down, maybe the ninth month of the kindergarten. I'm not sure exactly what that stands for. Okay, students will recognize the American flag, the Pledge of Allegiance, and that the President is the leader of the United States. I'm not sure if recognizing the Pledge of Allegiance, I don't know what that means, but recognizing the American flag. Okay, since recognizing the American flag is a concrete concept, it's a thing, it's a real thing, then being able to perform that, the best way to test that would be through fill-in-the-blank labeling or any of the selected response items. So here's a potentially valid item. Circle the official flag of the United States of America from those 3 choices. And I suppose in kindergarten you may need to read the question to the students. I'm not exactly sure. Okay. A defined concept, as you know, is a little bit more abstract than concrete concepts. Here's an example of one. Students will identify examples of making an economic choice and will explain the idea of opportunity cost. So those are defined concepts. You can only identify those based on since they're defined concepts, and you look at the guide, it indicates that there are quite a few constructed response items that would be appropriate, and and that what is recommended is for selected response would be this. And so here's just an example of a multiple choice item that would be appropriate for that type of outcome. Which of the questions is an example of an economic choice Paul might make? So they're having to identify, an example of the defined concept economic choice. Okay, rules. Okay, sorry about that. Where were we? Oh yes, here is a modified third grade standard. Determine costs. It's a rule, and you can see from the guide what types of items are most appropriate for rules. So here's an example. List 3 opportunity costs resulting from your decision to buy a new Nintendo Wii gaming system. That would be a short answer, constructed response item, and it would be appropriate for as a rule. The same. Here's an example, identifying and applying the traits of good citizenship. Again, one interesting thing about higher order rules is that you can measure them using lots of different kinds of constructed response, all of them, and also multiple choice works. Here's an example. After watching a video clip from the movie Toy Story, describe 3 different ways in which Woody demonstrated good citizenship. That is a higher order rule, and in this case, another short answer worked just fine. Let's look at attitudes on a related subject. Okay, here is a standard for first grade. Again, in social studies, students will value honesty and truthfulness in oneself and others. What a fabulous goal to shoot for. But of course, as an attitude, you have to translate that into something that's observable. How do you know that somebody values something? How could you tell? What could they do that would help you determine that they value honesty and truthfulness? Well, a modified version of this would be that students would choose to apply the traits of being a good citizen when they are, interacting with others. And again, attitudes can be measured in terms of selected responses through multiple choice, like survey items. But you can also ask constructed response, which would include short answer, essay, and of course performance, watching them or observing them, of a good assessment item. A teacher says this to the first grader: I'm going to put a star sticker next to your name every time I notice you acting like a good citizen in this class. So again, you're providing some feedback over the performance of students applying the traits of being a good citizen, whatever those are. And a motor skill or skill. Here's an example. Students will construct a simple map of a familiar area using basic map symbols. And as I indicated in the note, at one level this is a higher order rule, of course, because they're applying the rules of map making. But with younger kids, particularly first grade, it involves motor skills associated with drawing or maybe using scissors or whatever they would need to do in order to construct. And for motor skills, of course, it's not appropriate to measure motor skills using any type of item other than actual performance, actually do the thing. And again, an example of a motor skill outcome in social studies: using anything you want from the arting table, make a map of your neighborhood. The final step in this process is to follow. And by the way, those rules that are included in the assessment guide are based on, again, evidence of validity. That is, if you follow the rules, you will maximize the possibility that you will create valid items. They're also based on maximizing the efficiency, the time and accuracy of measuring learner performance. Also, you want to maximize the probability that correct answers reflect the performances that you want. You want to minimize correct answer guesses. That is, a student guessing something correctly even though they don't know how to perform the skill. That would be a type 1 error. Also maximizing the probability that incorrect answers reflect their level of performance. That would be type 2 errors. So students, you want to make sure that if a student does not respond correctly to an item, that it is really indicative of the fact that they can't perform that skill and not some other problem. And these rules are also based on you helping to encourage thoughtful thoughtfulness when it comes to assessment. So let's just look at a couple of these rules. I'm just going to give you some samples because there are a bunch of them again in the assessment guide, and I'm just going to poke at a couple of them. Some of the general rules include Rule 1.1, writing clear, concise directions. Being concise, that is so important. Rule number 2, you need to make sure that that your assessment items elicit the performances that are stated in the outcome or the objective under the conditions that are stated. And I have some examples that I include in the guide. I'm just going to Rule 1.3, if it's a complex task, include reminders of what you want the students to be able to do. It used to aggravate me to see like a labeling assignment where students needed to draw and label something, and then they would put labels near the item that they were asked to identify in their drawing, and they would get marked off for not drawing lines or arrows. And I just thought, that's you need to remind students that is part of the labeling process. That's not the skill is to measure whether they can understand or identify where something is in a diagram. So they shouldn't be penalized for not following labeling convention. Unless that's the skill you're measuring too. General rule. And including clear evaluation criteria. Some people don't like to do this because they think they're cueing a correct answer too much. But if you're going to be evaluating, say, an essay item and you're asking a rather broad question, it's important to identify clearly what you expect to have in your answer. Because, again, you're going to be minimizing bias this way, and that is the bias of somebody who might be able to interpret your directions and your intentions in the manner that you think is appropriate. So, to follow. And then let me just throw a couple of multiple choice rules. There are other general rules listed in the guide, just a couple of multiple choice rules. Here's one that's violated regularly, and that is don't use any choices in a multiple choice question that are obviously incorrect, because again, you're just minimizing the number of choices that somebody who's just not trying to game the test would legitimately pick from, and that's also, don't use words in the statement for multiple choice that cue the learners to what the possible answer might be. For example, here is Pierre de Fermat is best known as a what? Well, they wouldn't say as a inventor because it would be as an inventor. And so now they can eliminate A as a possible choice, and they're down to 3 instead of 4. So the chances of them guessing the correct answer would be 33% now, and that is probably, the odds are too much in their favor. The possibility of them not knowing who Fermat was but guessing it is too great. 3 choices generally. Here's another rule that's violated a lot. I think I violated this a couple of times even recently. Don't use all of the above. Because again, what this means is that if somebody can identify one of the possible choices as being not correct, then they also can eliminate all of the above, which means if it's 4 possible choices, they've just eliminated 2 of the 4, and now it's just a 50-50 guessing game for them. And that's just not what you want you don't want multiple choice to be a guessing game. You want the items to reflect, the best possible, indication that they really can do what you want them to. And again, don't use words like all or never in the answer options, because they almost always signify that an answer is incorrect, and kids know that. And of course, don't repeat words from the question in the answer option. And boy, I think I violated this at least once in the test I just gave you. I was reviewing it. I need to go back and make a few edits. It's easy to do, though. It's really easy to do when you're developing assessment items. And again, the reason why you don't want to do it is because you are cueing somebody to what the possible answer might be, and that's just gaming. That's just gaming the system. Don't use negative answer options following a negative stem, because then students have to do some kind of mental backflip in order to take the double negative and assume that it's a positive. And again, you're starting to deviate from the intention of the item when you do something like that. And one final special note, I used to, when I was a science teacher, I used to measure intellectual skills pretty well using a strategy that I learned called paired multiple choice, where you do one multiple choice item, asks students to solve a problem or to identify the correct answer to a problem, and then the next multiple choice item has them actually identifying the reason why they picked the right the answer that they did, and the item wouldn't be considered correct unless they got both of those right. And that kind of strategy can really get at intellectual skills using multiple choice strategies, which again, as a teacher trying to implement efficient assessments, that can be very, very. And finally, you can see the assessment guide for lots more rules, plenty of rules to follow.